Welcome to the Unshakable Hope podcast, where real life intersects redeeming love. I'm Kelly Hall, and this is where we wrestle through faith questions such as how do I trust God's heart when his ways and delays are breaking mine? We'll hear from people just like you and me who have experienced God's faithfulness when life didn't unfold as they expected. My prayer is that God would renew our hope in his word and his love through these conversations. Hey friends, my guest today is Crystal Mayo. She is a new friend I met last summer at a writer-speaker conference. I felt an instant connection to this young woman, and maybe part of it was because she grew up in Louisiana, just across the state line from where I grew up in Texas. So I loved her accent. At the age of 38, Crystal experienced a massive stroke. Her story's been featured in various books, magazines, as well as radio and podcast shows. We're going to be talking about her journey and how she held on to hope in God through it all. Her first book is called Lucy's Home. The subtitle is A True Story About a Boy Who Wanted a Dog. This is a touching children's story. It's beautifully illustrated, rooted in her family's real life experience, and is all about the power of prayer. We will be talking about a portion of that story today. I'd love for you to check it out. Maybe you'll discover it's the perfect Christmas gift for a young one in your family. I've already purchased mine. Crystal, I'm so thankful you were able to join me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about your family?
Okay. Well, my roots run deep in Southwest Louisiana, and they were teased, permed, and bleached from an early age because I grew up in a beauty shop that was just like Still Magnolias. Still Magnolias is the family was from Louisiana, filmed in Louisiana. And I felt like I grew up right in those beauty shop scenes. And my mom is an amazing woman of faith, and it was not a gossip, beauty shop. She was careful to gear the conversations back to a honoring place, and she would always pray with her clients. We just saw many miracles come through there. So it was like a ripple effect. There was a creek that ran out behind the beauty shop, and I would sometimes go out there and skip with any of the kids that came in the beauty shop. We'd go skip rocks out there, and you just see those ripples form in the creek. Well, the same thing happened in the beauty shop. And so just the power of one prayer and how it could change everything. That's how I grew up. I met my husband, and that was an amazing story too. I was away at a different college, and then
Yeah.
my mom called and said, "I think you should come home for the summer." And I gave up everything, internship, all the things I was in, and I honored her and came home that summer. And I had a horrible job, a horrible I didn't get paid hardly any money, and I thought, "Why did I do all of this?" And the Lord opened the doors for me to attend a local university, and I liked the education better there. But I ended up going there full paid scholarship just from that lousy job that I thought, "Why am I wasting my time here?" It wasn't a waste, and then I met my husband not too long after that, and the rest is history, as they say.
Love it.
And we've been married 24 years, and we have 3 kids, and our oldest is in that same university. He's a sophomore in college, and then we have a senior in high school and then a sophomore. So 2 boys and a girl.
Oh, that is awesome. Thank you. You need to write a book about those times in the beauty shop with your mom.
Yes, I wanna call those the yellow chair diaries. So if those yellow chairs that I sat in, if they could talk, what would they tell? And that's what I hope to produce next.
Okay, really cool. Well, Crystal, I really want to talk about what happened when you had a massive stroke. You were only 38 years old and you
Yeah.
had a massive stroke. Can you just take us to that day? It was in August of 2016 and tell us what happened.
Our anniversary is August the 12th, and that week well, let me back up a little bit. I had been feeling called to homeschool my kids, so I prepared, and I prepared, and I prepared like a mad woman. I gathered so much curriculum that there is no way a school district would have even been able to teach what all I collected. And so I worked so hard at all of this stuff, and we were gonna, we finished out the school year where they were in public school, and then we were gonna start. that next week with homeschool. So I had co-ops to attend and I was going to be a tutor. And so there was all these plans and yet they all crumbled.
Oh,
They did not work out. So it started on Sunday. I had a headache and just not feeling myself. I was a little dizzy and the dizziness just grew and grew and grew. And by Wednesday, I went to see my doctor and I remember even having to brace myself when I walked. And but I could still walk. I was able to communicate and it just things weren't right, but they looked in my ears and said I had vertigo. They said my crystals were out of alignment and that I had vertigo. It wasn't vertigo. So
no.
they were gonna refer me to a specialist and I just was so tired. They gave me some medicine and it made me do was sleep. Well, my kids were very young then and busy mom, you don't get the luxury of just sleeping all day. So my husband
No.
had taken quite a bit off that week. My father-in-law came and, he'd come and sit with me and or take me to the doctor, just whatever I needed. And so we had some friends come in that weekend on Saturday and I was just not myself. I was just things were off. And after they left, I just told my husband, I need to go lay down. I can't, think straight almost. And before I did, I got on my knees before I crawled into the bed. And I just said, Lord, if there's something more here, will you tell me? And I took a nap. And when I woke up, my legs didn't work. I tumbled out on the floor and it was clear there was a problem. I called for my husband and he came and got me. I just said something's wrong. My legs aren't working. So he helped put me in the chair. We decided to take our kids to his parents' house and then we went to the ER in our hometown. And I was in there for most of the night as they ran tests. They did a CT scan, they did some blood work, some different things. And it all came back fine.
Ugh,
They couldn't see anything, and I got a lengthy lecture on that. It was anxiety, that I was exhibiting symptoms of anxiety.
oh,
Sarcastically, I'm like, "Well, when your legs don't work, you kinda do have some anxiety there." And
yeah, that's gonna trigger some stress, right. That is
right.
so weird.
Yeah, yeah, so we knew that wasn't right, and we were exhausted, and then we came home and took a little nap, and then we left and decided to go to Houston, and God confirmed that by different people calling me, and I was in, I think, the pediatrician's office that week, and he happened to call me that Sunday morning and say, "Hey, I was just thinking about you. Are you okay? I know you were kinda feeling weird this week," and I said, I keep my legs aren't working now." And he said, "Yeah, you should go to Houston." So we went to Houston, we went to Houston Methodist, and then there was another friend who called and said, "Hey, I just wanna check on you, how you doing?" And I said, My legs aren't working now." And she ran into a classroom to pray for me. She was at church that Sunday morning, and her doctor, who happens to teach Sunday school, was there, and he had just dismissed his class. And so he got on the phone with me and prayed. And he also said, "Yeah, you should go to Houston Methodist." So we went, and it was so stormy. And I remember my mom met us at in a near town, and we filled up with gas. Our vehicle got it was filled up with water. Something water got into the gas tank and,
Oh,
our vehicle wouldn't crank, and, so my mom was there, and we crawled into her vehicle, but my husband had to it was like a dance we've never had before, and it was storming, it was pouring down rain, and he had to maneuver the umbrella over us and hold me, and then we kind of maneuvered our way into the car, and, I mean, Doug has been he was the rock through it all, and he would just pick me up and carry me, but he did that.
Crystal, that is so frightening.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, we made it to Houston Methodist, and they almost sent me home, and because I could communicate, but I could not text, which was very odd. I could not
Hmm.
text. It was very garbled, but I could still communicate verbally. But the head of the ER came to me, and he said, "You can't walk?" And I said, "No." And He said, "Well, my residents seem to miss that." He said, "You don't wanna get sick in August because the residents are new and sometimes they miss some things.
Oh, good to know. Let's all write that down for
Don't
future
get sick.
reference.
Don't get sick in August." But no, they ran tests. They sent me for an MRI, and that was in the middle of the night. Well, we're around midnight probably. They took me up, and I've since I was a little girl, I was sick when I was a little girl, real sick, and had to be in the hospital. And I think I just had some triggers there of past illnesses, and just I didn't want to be alone in that room, but it was like the Lord would send a nice orderly or somebody to just kind of be there with me. And I remember going into the MRI, and MRIs can be so claustrophobic and loud,
Right,
but there was so much peace in the middle of that you could only say it was God.
right.
And so they sent me back, put me in a room, and at 1 in the morning, one of the doctors said, "Mrs. Mayo," and I was so tired, I didn't even want to open my eyes. And she said again, "Mrs. Mayo, I need to talk to you." And my eyes remained closed until she said, "Mrs. Mayo, you've had a stroke." And I was just, "A stroke? What is a stroke? Only older people I know have had strokes." And I
Yeah.
was 30 years old. Why am I having a stroke? And she said, "We're going to be moving you to the stroke ward and we'll be doing more tests." And after she left, I just remember being like, "Lord, what what is this? What?" And I felt his peace, his presence come near me as though he was standing right there on the right side of my bed. And I heard 4 words that I'll never forget. And he said, "I will restore you."
Mhm.
And those 4 words were a lifeline, but also took complete faith to believe, because I ended up having so many deficiencies, as in I was blind, partially blind in both eyes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, could not read. I had a hard time with memory, could not handle sound and smells. All of my senses were off the chart. And so going outside of the 4 walls of the hospital were traumatic
Mm.
and traumatizing. And
Yeah.
no, my recovery took 3 years, and so there's a lot in that to unpack, but God was faithful, and today you cannot tell. If you met me, if you looked at me, you would just not know that I had been through so much trauma and therapy. And
Wow. So everything has been restored. Everything.
yes.
Wow.
Yes.
That is absolutely miraculous and amazing. I love so much that you felt God's peace with you. That is a comfort for all of us when we're walking through hard times. It wasn't that you prayed just the right way. It wasn't that you did just the right things. It's because you knew Christ
Yeah.
and Jesus was with you. He is
Yeah.
with you and
Yeah.
you felt his presence. That is shows the heart of God in such a beautiful way.
Yeah. And I do think community prayer is a factor in it
Oh,
too. There was so many, the prayer chains went out, and
yeah.
just it was unreal. And then when we returned home, I was in the hospital 18 days, and they ran every test in the world and they could not figure out what happened. But
Wow.
they discovered I had a pretty massive stroke, and it affected 2 sides of my brain. And so there's, 2 parts here that were affected. And I saw a different neurologist at some point, and he just talked to me as normal. And then he comes back in the room and he goes, "Whoa, do you know you had a massive stroke?" And so you can't tell, but there's evidence in here. There's scars. And that's kind of how we all are. There's scars and things you don't see, but there's been some things that have happened underneath.
Whoa. That is crazy. I cannot believe all that you went through. I can't, and they couldn't ever determine what happened.
Yeah.
I did you ever go back to that first hospital and say, "Told you so"?
No, it wasn't worth it, I think. But
Of
no, I
course
never
not.
did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I am so thankful for your restoration, and I have heard many stories, and I love these kind of stories so much that the moment or right before something is about to happen, God will say something like, "I will be with you. Don't worry. Don't be afraid." Just something comforting. right at the beginning of a very difficult season or right before to prepare you. And I love that God gave you that promise, I will restore you.
Mhm.
So he gave you something to cling to, a promise from God. We know God doesn't lie. But when you go through a long season of not seeing a promise being answered,
Right.
surely there is quite a lot of doubt, a lot of wrestling. So, can you describe that season? How did you hold on to hope in those dark days when you questioned whether that promise would ever be fulfilled?
Yeah. Well, I went through a lot of therapy, but God would send the right therapist in and help with that. But I have this children's book that it talks about my son's answer to prayer, and he wanted a dog so badly, and I would say, "Baby, I'm not a dog person. Daddy has said no, and we do not have room in our home for a dog." So this was pre-stroke. And I finally told him, I was a children's director at the time, and I said, "You can pray about it." And I always talk to the kids about, "You can pray, you can pray." Well, he did, and then God answered his prayer and gave us this dog, and the book talks about how that came about. But this little dog I did not want became my answer to prayer because as I'm learning to walk again, she was there. And as I could not pick myself off the couch, she was there. She just was everything I needed in that season for to make it through. And the perfect little companion because we didn't know if I was going to need a sitter. We just didn't had no idea the depths of the damage that had been done and what it would take to recover. So, but with the Lord, it fast forward 2 years, and I just was holding on to that promise of, "God, you will restore me," but I'm not restored. I felt like a prisoner in my mind because I felt like I couldn't handle driving. I didn't drive for 2 years. I didn't like, I just could not handle it, mentally, could even managing kids and just, life, and it was all I could do just to function. And so, at one point, I was in my closet, and I was reading through the Gospels and came across so many stories where Jesus healed one person after another and after another. And I came to the woman with the issue of blood, and something about that day was just different. And those holy encounters you have? Well,
Yeah.
our closets can be holy too. I came across the woman with the issue of blood, and just something about it sparked in my imagination. What if Jesus was here with me right now? And we know that we could talk to the Lord, but I needed something more tangible. So I took one of my husband's shirts and I put it right in front of me, hanging where I was sitting. And I
Yeah.
took some sandals. I was like, sandals feel more appropriate than tennis shoes for Jesus. So I put some sandals down there at the bottom, and I just held on to the hem of that t-shirt, and I cried out to the Lord and just, like, I think I had just been holding it all in
Yeah.
and not really talking about it, and at that moment, we just had a moment, him and I, and that was the day the breakthrough came, it started, and that's a whole long story in and of itself, but I'm like, "How can I sum it up?" But the Lord put the right people in place to create a domino effect to where I began to start seeing the healing happen, and, I had to walk in faith because when you're diagnosed with something like I was, you're given all of the statistics and how they are unfavorable in your department.
Yeah.
So, if you do this, you will be better. But if you don't do this, you will have another one and it'll be worse and it'll be this and it'll be that. And so there was a lot of fear that I heard from the medical team about what I was to do, what I was to take. And not all of that was tailor made for me. And so the Lord took me on a different path and brought me to some people who would say, "I'm not sure you should be taking that," or I think you should think about this." And it took a lot of faith because you're hearing the negative on one side. And
Yeah.
then, so it ended up to where I ended up trusting. the Lord, and little by little, it was like, okay, okay. And then to where I almost didn't need any medicine. And
Wow.
it just little by little, the Lord healed me. But that day that I met him in the closet was the beginning of the breakthrough.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I know that that story resonates with many of my listeners who are dealing with chronic illnesses. And for me, as a mom with daughters who also have chronic Lyme disease, I can so relate to what you're talking about. Her God is a creative God. And the medical communities can say one thing, but maybe God leads us to a particular doctor in a particular place with a particular treatment. And that's the path he chooses for us. So I appreciate the way you opened your mind to how God was leading you in the healing journey. And the other thing that I love so much is that it all began with you touching the hem of Jesus' garment, figuratively speaking, but really spiritually in your heart. That's what you were doing. You fully surrendered in that place. That was so powerful. That was so powerful. I wish you could reenact that for us. I wish it were a movie that we could watch.
Right. Right. Yes, I have done that for a different women's event, and I'm wondering if I could pull it up, but I'll have to send you that if I can pull that up.
Okay, that'd be great. Well, you did mention that there was fear present in your faith journey, and we all struggle with fear. We struggle with worry about the future. Were there any particular verses that God brought to mind to help you grab hold of so that you could have peace?
Right. Proverbs 31 was the scripture. I'm going to turn there. A friend came and visited us in the hospital, and she brought me a picture where she only printed out the last part of Proverbs 31. This version's different, but she's clothed with strength and dignity and can laugh without fear of the future. She framed it and I put it in the window. When I went into in-person rehab, I asked the Lord, "Can we have a room with a view?" And we got the most beautiful room, and it overlooked Rice University's soccer field, and they had different games happening then, and it was a great view. But that picture would just sit in the corner of that hospital room, and I was so full of fear. That is what made me a prisoner in my own home was fear because how they could not determine how it happened. How do you go on? How do you know that it's not happening? What is that funny feeling in my body today? Am I having one now? I mean, just fear, unbelievable. Well, my
Yeah,
kids have this. Is this hereditary? I mean, you want to talk about fear?
yeah.
Some some big time fear, and I like to be a person who I was on the move for sure. I had plans, this is what I'm gonna do, and all that stopped. All of that stopped.
Oh,
And I just remember always looking at that plaque. My friend gave me that picture and just wondering, like, will I ever arrive to this spot to where I can? Because I didn't feel dignified at all. I felt like my life was a mess. I felt like I there was nothing that was together in me. And then to and then to say, "And she can laugh without fear of the future." And I think it's just experiencing the perfect love of God helped heal that in me.
mm,
His perfect love cast out fear. And so just when I experienced his perfect love, it helped uproot that stronghold I had. And I think that fear came back to that childhood trauma when I was sick and in the hospital and then full
yeah.
circle. Didn't realize that until one day I just was like, when fast forward to 2020 when I had COVID, it put back a lot of the symptoms of what I felt like when I had the stroke. And
Mm,
I called two of my prayer warriors and I said, y'all have got to meet me at church or I'm not going to make it. And they did, and my pastor happened to be there at the time. They were expected to have a baby soon, but for whatever reason, the Lord orchestrated that he'd be at the church. And he helped walk me through that process, and it just was a revelation to me of this was a stronghold in my life to where a traumatic thing that happened in my childhood was triggering me in my adulthood. But the Lord helped to, just my pastor said, he took me through this exercise and he was like, "What do you see?" And I said, "A hospital room." And I said, "But this isn't where I had the stroke." And I think I was 5 when I got sick when we went on vacation,
Yeah.
and and so I said, "This was when I was little," and I barely had memories of it. I had to call my mom and say, "Remind me of that trip and when I was in the hospital," because I remember being sick, but I didn't remember all of that. And he said, "What was the lie you believed?" And it was like that God couldn't take care of me, but it was like, "Well, where do you see Jesus in it?" And I was like, "In the teddy bear." So I had had a teddy bear given to me in that trip. And so anyway, it was just beautiful. But isn't that something how we just never know what happens in childhood that you barely even remember can be such a trigger for something in adulthood? And
Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely. We talk about that a lot on this show that Jesus is our healer. He is our soul healer, first and foremost, and he deals with these deep issues. So I love the way you illustrated how we can pray through that. Go back, Jesus, where did this come from? What is this fear rooted in? And picture that place and then ask, where do you see Jesus in this place? And he will meet you in these deep fears, and when he met you there, when you saw him there, did that uproot the stronghold of fear in your life?
I think that's what I said to my pastor. I was like, Was that a stronghold? What is it?" He was like, yes. And so I think it just set me free to understand where this came from and that it was built on a lie that wasn't true. You know,
Yes.
I that trauma when I was a kid, we had gone on vacation and I picked up a virus, but it was a really bad virus. And I think it was traumatic as a kid to be brought to the hospital. And then I remember having to they like helped undress me and put me in a gown, like a hospital gown, all things that are normal, but they had to hold me down because I was fighting them to put an IV in. And just that trauma, which is like we all understand was normal for a kid to have to go to the hospital. There wasn't anything abusive happening, that's how they handled me, and I just remember being afraid in that moment because I think my mom couldn't be there right at that time when I was in that room, and so just the trauma of it, but I'm so glad that the Lord will, set us free from those things that, take root, so
Absolutely. This just makes me think of this particular verse. It's in Psalm 112, verse 7, and it says, he will have no fear of bad news. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. His heart is secure. He will have no fear. In the end, he will look in triumph on his foes, on his enemies. And that's such a beautiful description of really what God did for you in that place. I just love it so much. Thank you, God.
yeah.
Because the question I want to ask is, can I really live without fear in these places where, when I look sometimes at the chronic Lyme disease that one of my daughters is still deeply impacted by, and I feel God has promised he's going to set her free. But sometimes the fear and panic can be overwhelming, and I have to go to that place with the Lord, just as you did. I have to find the lies and ask him to speak into them.
Yeah, when you said that, when we're going through things or, can we live without fear?
Yeah.
I've About 2 years ago, my oldest, he got into a pretty bad accident and we were alerted by Life 360. So we have that app on all of our family members' phone. And so Life 360 comes up on my phone and I'm like, Life 360, what is that? And so I swiped it away and then I was like, wait a minute, maybe I should answer. And so I answered and they said, Anthony appears to have been in an accident. We've called all of the authorities and we just wanted to let you know that. And it was just,
Oh,
you
Chris,
know,
cannot imagine.
so it's like, what's happening? It's like everything's spinning, but yet there was still peace in the midst of that storm to know I don't know what we're about to face, but I know God will get us through. I know that I can trust him, but I don't know what's about to be on the other side of this phone call. And it was miraculous. He got in a very bad accident and he only broke his leg by the grace of God. But
Wow.
they had a helicopter waiting for him because they thought he was going to have to be life flighted away, but it didn't have to. And so it was really, truly, truly a miracle that he was okay. But
Thank God.
yes, so and it really cultivated faith in his faith too. As the smoke's rising from the truck, he's praying and asking God to help him not catch on fire, and it was something else. But my husband arrived to the scene, and he stayed back, and he asked the sheriff, he said, "That's my son in there." And he said, "Is he okay? How is he?" And he was like, "He's alive. He's alive. He's talking to us, and he's got a really good personality. So he's doing okay. He's doing okay." And it was amazing to see the community come out and help him. So he had just finished from swim practice. He was a year-round swimmer that year, and he was thinking about going to state, and he just missed that 18-wheeler. There was an accident up ahead, and he ran right into the back of an 18-wheeler,
Oh,
and that's how he broke his leg, and everything shifted. That truck was totaled. But by the grace of God, I remember being in that moment thinking, "I don't know what's on the other side of this, but I know that God will be with me, whatever's gonna happen."
yes, absolutely. So I'm very curious, as you have described how God met you, really, that just fills my heart up with so much hope in God's faithfulness and in his ever present help. We are never separated from his love. We're never separated from his care. He is intimately involved in our stories and invested. He's already gone before us into every single situation. That brings us so much peace and comfort in our anxieties and as stories unfold that we don't expect, like the one you just shared about your son being in a car accident. So I want to ask you what truth about God's character comforted you the most as you have been through all of these adventures and learned to find peace?
I think it's his faithfulness. He has met me at every phase of my life, and how I first came to know the Lord, my friend calls it the floorboard revival. We were on a road trip. We were on a road trip, and in those days, my parents didn't use seat belts, and so I would just lay out in the car. And I remember thinking, uh, feeling the Holy Spirit come to me, and if I had gotten in an accident in that moment, where would I go? And I remember crying out to the Lord that, I was a sinner and to please save me. And I had grown up in church. I think at one point I had at a vacation Bible school, they had done an altar call, and my friend said, "I'm going down to the front. Who's coming with me?" And I was like, "Sit down. You don't do this until you're older. Like, sit down." And she was like, "No, I'm going. I want to be saved." And I just was like, what is she doing?" And then I ended up going up to the front and making a decision and praying. But it wasn't until I think that floorboard revival that I just really felt that's when the Holy Spirit was calling me. And,
Mm.
there was a time when I was in high school, and my parents had separated, and they had called me to the living room, and they asked if I'd come join them. And it was like, as I walked through that room, the tension, I mean, my body was cutting the tension like a knife. And
Mm.
they sat me down and said that they weren't gonna stay together. So I didn't understand what that would mean, and after they were done talking, I asked if I could go to my room, and so I went to my room, and the first thing I did was just shut my door and get on my knees and say, "God, what do you do with this?" And so, leading up to that, the Lord had been calling me. So after the floorboard revival, I had got interested in the Bible, and I asked my mom, could I have a different Bible? Because I was using my brother's children's Bible, and I was like, "Can I have that Bible?" So we went to the, store and picked out a new Bible, and I loved that my name was on the front. And so I just would dig into his word. And then that day when they told me that they weren't gonna stay together, I just said, "Lord, what do you do with this?" And it was like I held out my hands like they held all the broken pieces of my heart. And he said, "Open your Bible." And I pulled it over. It fell open to Psalm. I'd have to look at what verse. It's 26, 3, or that's not right. But it fell open to the verse that says, "Even though your father and mother forsake you, I will be with you."
Mm.
His faithful love has been with me my whole life. And so he met me there in my bedroom during that. Another time he met me in the bedroom was I'd come home from a date. This was pre my husband. And I was like, "Lord, I am so tired of dating boys. Could you have my husband call?" And the phone rang that very minute. And it was my future husband. And I was like, "Hello, is it me you're looking for?" Like, who's on the other end of this phone call?
That
They
is
were
so cute. I love the power of God to intervene in our stories. That's so beautiful. I want to pause for a minute. Crystal, I want to look up the reference for that verse.
sorry. You might like this anyway, because this is the one.
Oh, that is the Bible that you had when you were a child.
Yeah, and like how much it's falling apart. They say a Bible that's falling apart means your life's not. So it is Psalm 27 and 10.
Psalm 27:10. Can you read that for us?
Yeah, this version says, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me.
What a powerful verse for God to give you right at that moment when you felt like your life was falling apart. And now your Bible is falling apart.
Yeah, he completely spoke through the word. And it wasn't, I always like to make this point clear. It wasn't that they forsake me. It just the Lord knew the desperation in that moment.
Right,
Um,
right.
there was some issues the Lord had to address. They ended up getting back together at the end of that summer, but there's a lot of water under that bridge. They ended up divorcing after 46 years. And not too long after that, my dad got sick and I had to take care of him, and our relationship was not so good. But the Lord brought that's when this dog ran into our lives. And it was a healing balm for me to go and take care of my dad. And this dog showed up at his house, and we were able to go visit and play with the dog because it made things easier. So the Lord he was just been faithful through every chapter of my life, the stroke story, all of it.
Yeah. So just to clarify, you're talking about the dog Lucy that you wrote the children's book about. Sh- Crystal's holding up the book on our YouTube video. Just for those who are listening and not watching, that's beautiful the way God met you there when that's where the dog came about. But I just wanted you to clarify very briefly what you had said about your parents. So they were divorced and then they got back together and then your dad got sick. Is that the story?
Well, they separated that year when the Lord gave me that verse that though your father and mother forsake you, I will be with you. Then they ended up getting back together at the end of that year. They were married for several more decades. And so after 46 years, they divorced. And then my dad got sick, and my dad became my responsibility. It was a hard time because it was not a gift for me to want to go and take care of him. But the Lord, as I was taking care of my dad, he was a diabetic, and I would take care of his wounds. The Lord was healing mine. And by the end,
Mm.
in the last few months before my dad passed, he would just pat my hand and say, "You're such a good daughter. You're such a good daughter." And so I think my dad just didn't know how to love, and he
Yeah.
had not experienced love. But when
Yeah.
I honored him and took care of him, his heart changed. I'm
And
grateful that I ended with that in our story. So there was restoration. And even between my parents, my mom felt his hands when he took his last breaths. And she had already remarried, and I have a wonderful stepdad, but mom was there when he passed, when my dad passed. And so it's just God's grace was all over that moment. And
wow.
yeah,
Crystal, we've covered a lot of ground today. Oh my.
like we ran a marathon, huh?
Yeah. I love that we got to celebrate God's faithfulness in such very clear and tangible ways. And I know that this hands my listeners hope. This is what God's used so much in my life as I was growing up. And I just tried to understand that God redeems our hard stories. And I remember that what I gravitated the most toward were actual stories. I wanted to see it lived out in people's lives because that's what helped me have hope in my hard places. And I know that today God has taken this story and handed that same type of hope to our listeners. Thank you so much, Crystal, for sharing God's faithfulness today. And before we close, would you please give your website for our listeners so that they can
I'm
connect
sure.
with you?
Yes, the website is www.crystal, CRYSTALH, Mayo, MAYO.com.
Okay, crystalhmayo.com. Thank you so much. God bless you, my friend.
Bless you. Thank you so much, Kelly.
If you were encouraged in your faith today, It'd be great if you'd help get the word out by subscribing, sharing with a friend, or leaving a review. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out through my website, kellyhall.org, and pick up some free resources while you're there. Thanks for listening to the Unshakable Hope Podcast.